Okay, let's begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Climate Declarations webinar series. This evening's discussion is an unusual one, and that we're going to be talking about a webinar that we did earlier, well, an interview of Luke Kemp. And the reason we did it the way we've done it is because Luke was in the UK and the timing simply didn't work for him to do it during our usual time. So hopefully this will still work and be useful exchange for all of us. Our climate declaration has been doing these webinars for, I think, several years now. I can't remember how many. All of our webinars are on our climate declaration website or a Substack. And there's many very interesting ones there, and encourage people to have a browse and see what might attract their attention. I'd like to acknowledge and welcome our co-sponsors for this evening. That is Degrowth Aotearoa New Zealand, the Wise Response Society, and Engineers for Social Responsibility. I'd first like to make just a couple of introductory remarks about tonight's topic, societal collapse. It's a very difficult topic, both cognitively and emotionally. You know, the scale and complexity is hard to fully comprehend, to feel we really have a grasp of what's happening. It's also an emotionally difficult topic because it's a bit scary in its implications. But, that scariness is also motivating to help us understand and see what we can understand and help us determine what to expect and what we can do. So let's keep in mind these sort of cognitive and emotional challenges to what we're about to discuss. And let's admit at the outset that we're very unlikely to come up with any definitive answers about whether collapse is happening or what impact it might be, or the best actions forward. We simply can't know the future with any assurance. But together, we can explore and share the possibilities and share our perspectives. And of course, each of us will attach our own subjective probabilities to those expectations. And these subjective probabilities will seem very real to each of us, but each of them will be a reflection of our own unique circumstances, what we know about these issues and our temperaments. None of them will be perfect. But by sharing our perspectives, hopefully we'll be able to expand our insight and knowledge about this difficult and scary topic. Okay, that's by way of just introductory comments. And what we thought we'd do to give this discussion some structure is to break it into these three sections. First of all, Sahra and I will make a few comments about what struck us about the interview with Luke and his book, and invite you to make your comments about what you thought was important and interesting and sort of perhaps changed your view of things or provided new information, or things that you might want to critique about it that you found, were missing, for example. So we'll spend a few minutes on that, and then we'll talk about how relevant the framework Luke presents and how he defines Goliaths and how relevant that might be for our current situation. And then the third section will be, what do we do about it? Whatever we think might be happening now, are we in a collapse phase? Is it going to happen? Is it many centuries away? We don't know. Each of us will have a different perspective. But whatever our take on it is, how we might view it and prepare for it is what we'll try to deal with in the third section. So if you could keep this framework in mind, these three different categories for your comments and questions and discussions with each other. So to start that off, we'll ask Sahra to make some comments briefly about her own reaction to Luke's work and share that with you just to sort of get things going. And I'll do the same, and then we'll open it to the rest of you. Go ahead, Sahra.
Yeah, well, good evening, and thank you for coming. It's always so hard to know with these sort of events, are we going to get 60 people, 40 people, three people? And so I'm delighted to see you both, you three. And yeah, I mean, as Jack and I were just saying, it's there's a lot that's competing for people's attention currently, and this is a difficult topic, and so yeah, I guess it's something that we're keen to raise the profile of. And I think Luke Kemp is one of the people who I feel has been able to penetrate mainstream awareness through his book incredibly effectively. I listened to another interview that he did this morning, and it was an interview that he did with a U.S. senator 2 weeks ago. So it was after the beginning of the war in Iran, and it's just great. He's on really a lot of best-selling lists and all of that. And I just hope that people will start to think about power structures differently and realize just how the precursors to societal collapse are pretty obvious, and that there are still things that we can do since we recognize the danger signs that are perhaps rectifying. He talks about being collapse resistant, or counter dominance strategies to shift the distribution of power. And so I think for me personally, when I have really considered his work, it has relevance for me from the kind of small individual perspective, us individual humans, and then it has relevance in terms of the system and what we can do to prevent the worst. So, the way that he talks about democracy has been really meaningful to me. And in my conversation with Jack afterwards, I realized that I didn't even really have a discernment around the different types of democracy. I kind of thought there's this thing, democracy, and, it's not working very well. And I was frustrated about that. But, representative democracy is really different than participatory democracy and deliberative democracy. And one of the things that Luke Kemp emphasizes really strongly in all of his work is that increasing inequality is one of the greatest drivers towards collapse, has always been in every civilization that has collapsed before. And so ways of rebalancing and making the society more equitable, as we all know this, but it just made a lot of sense to me as an argument for why we need wealth redistribution so urgently to stabilize the society. Because if there's this massive wealth inequality, then you get a shift towards authoritarianism, and then you get this increasing instability. So the systemic discussion that Luke brings in terms of what's needed felt very, very well considered to me. But personally, I think what was really meaningful on the kind of micro level, the more individual level, was that I felt really heartened by the way that he describes our true humanity, our human nature. And he made this really beautiful comment that he feels pessimistic about the future, but optimistic about humanity. And that so resonated with me after diving into his work, realizing that, at the core, we have evolved to be generous and collaborative, and our period of 95% of our history was in the Paleolithic, where we were in relationship with each other and the land, and it was all about reciprocity and collaboration, and that is what is in our DNA. And it's demonstrated now in communities that face disaster. People often come back to a place of wanting to share and wanting to collaborate. And that is the natural state that we return to in ourselves. So I felt really inspired by his work. And it gave me a sense of investing further in the relationships around me. And of course, we all know what we need to do, which is to simplify and become sort of more enmeshed with those around us and have a sense of resilience in our small scale communities. But somehow going deeper into the history of our natural tendencies as humans was really encouraging to me. And I could go on, but I'll just leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have some good conversations still over the next hour or so.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that certainly was one of the things that struck me as well about Luke's work, and that is how humanity lived, how we lived before empires and so-called civilization emerged. Um, I had known a little bit about it, but I think Luke did a much more thorough job of describing the evidence that's available that we lived in a very, very egalitarian way for millennia. And that meant we were self-organizing. It must have been participatory democracy because we didn't live just in small groups. We lived in quite large groups, in settlements of thousands of people
Mm.
without a dominant hierarchy. And that really I found surprising and encouraging and really fascinating. People were actually healthier, had more leisure time. People traveled extensively and traded. Um, and they had a low ecological footprint, they weren't, so it was a complex society. We tend to think of it as very primitive, but in fact, the evidence is that it was complex in a social way where people shared and participated in decision making with each other to survive. So that was, demonstrated to me what we're capable of. As Sarah said, it's in our DNA. This is how we managed for so long. And the other thing that struck me was the very notion of civilization. I certainly had many questions about what we identified as progress in terms of technological development and material well-being and so on. But I never really thought that civilization itself was a problem in the sense of it being a dominance hierarchy.
Mm.
And Kemp talks not just about the fact there was a dominance hierarchy, but that there were nested hierarchies. There was the royalty over the subjects. There were men over women. There was, rich over poor. There was this race over that race, this religion over that religion, us against them. Um, there's so many frameworks for dominance that we've simply taken for granted as the natural way. But as Kemp points out, the elite's dominance, their dominant elite, also set the narrative. That's the story they tell us. But that's
Mm.
not the way we actually lived prior to that.
Mm.
And I find that really, really fascinating. Um, and when the other thing that struck me about civilization and its emergence and the fact that it wasn't actually very civilized compared to what went before. In fact, it was the opposite. People were less healthy, there was more inequality, less leisure, and very importantly, I think, especially when we look at what's happening today, civilization brought organized violence.
Mm.
The evidence from the Paleolithic period is there was not any organized violence. There was, I mean, people did have, murders and that sort of things, but the evidence available suggests that it was a very low level. Um,
1%
and yeah,
out of 100 people. Mm.
and that there were no armies, there were no battles, regular battles. And what did exist was quite ritualized. So anyway, those are some of the things that struck me, and I'm curious as to what others think. So I'll open it up for discussion from any of the participants, because this is meant to be a discussion, not just for Sarah and
Mm.
I to be yapping
Mm.
at.
Mhm.
So would anyone, if you could use the either just raise your hand or unmute yourself and
Just jump in. I think we're such a small group. Feel free to.
just jump in. Gavin, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, Tēnā koutou. It's lovely to meet you people. I haven't been on a Zoom for a long time. Um,
Um,
I'm a bit behind the most of you in that I haven't been able to watch his whole interview yet, but really bowled over by the first less than half of it, and exactly those insights. Um, my first reaction was, oh, I must rush back and read up the arguments of the sort of 19th century anarchists, because he's talking about the virtues of anarchism, really. I thought it'd be quite interesting to prop it up with those arguments too. Um, I do find myself, having for a long time, hoping for some sort of collapse, just hoping it's the most, the best sort that we can cope with somehow. But so it's really, really topical, relevant to talk about that.
yeah. When you say anarchist, I mean, my impression was that people were self-organizing. I mean, yeah, I guess it depends on how you view anarchy or what
I
what
have to,
what flavor of anarchy you're talking about.
it's 20 years since I read it, but this guy Kropotkin, and it is
Yeah,
just the whole concept that good things can happen without all that organization, self-organization. Yeah.
yeah. Self-organization that's what we did,
Yes.
and somehow we've unlearned it,
It sounds like an ideal, but it's great to find it was absolute fact. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that was one of the things that we found fascinating as well. Anyone else would like to comment? And Bev, go ahead, unmute yourself and
Thanks for the reminder, Jack. Um, Talking about, I was really excited, as you were, obviously, about the first part of Luke Kemp's discussion, and that was about the Paleolithic times and how people organized themselves in a kind of natural, spontaneous, smooth-flowing way, involving care for one another, and also how we grew as a strong population because our gene pool was so wide. And I've got half of my family is Cook Island, and the gene pool from the Cooks is very small. So there's a lot of things that have gone wrong in various of our relations and even my own grandchildren. And that really emphasizes that. But I wondered, Jack and Sarah, if this dominance hierarchy and the subsets, etc., in the Paleolithic times, it doesn't appear to have been boundaries, physical boundaries between communities, much like walls and areas where people fight over. And in a small scale, it's the suburbs of a town with great big fences, so you can hardly see your neighbours. Do you think those boundaries, once they came into the piece and people started to look at this is mine, mine, and not yours, and I'm going to take over yours. That's part of dominance nature, isn't it? Do you think boundaries has been a real problem? Borders, boundaries, nations demanding that they take over their neighbor, etc.?
Well, I mean, the whole history of the commons and the enclosure of the commons. I mean, in the UK alone, my understanding is there were literally thousands of regulations, laws passed to enclose the commons for private benefit. So it's creating boundaries. I mean, people prior, when people were using common land and sharing it with each other and following rules, um, they they seem to be able to manage that well. But when the elites decided, that's a nice piece of land, I'd like to take it over, they were able to have their way in the parliament and enclose it. And we've seen that. I mean, colonialism was enclosure writ large, by taking over whole nations or areas of what was otherwise used as common land.
Yeah, so the answer perhaps is to open up. Thanks for that.
And it actually reminds me too of Sarah mentioned just briefly that during the Paleolithic period, people who self-organized must have used what Luke calls counter-dominant strategies, so that because they were very egalitarian and were able to maintain that egalitarianism for millennia,
Yeah.
surely there were people who attempted to become dominant and exert undue influence. But there's evidence more from indigenous tribes that anthropologists have studied, that these groups have what are called counter-dominant strategies. That is, if someone isn't following the rules of sharing and mutual benefit, they're either ridiculed or ostracized, and in some cases actually murdered. So pretty heavy ways of control people that became dominant. But somehow or other that broke down at a certain point. And Kemp talks about what led to breaking down. The idea of having a surplus, as they did with grain, what he calls lootable resources. But anyway, is there anyone else who wanted to make any comments about their reactions to Luke's either the book or any of the interviews that he's done? He's done many, and they're all a little different and worth watching.
Yeah, if I could just briefly respond to you as well, Beverly. I think one of the things that I found really helpful with the way that Kemp sort of lays out an understanding of, how we got here. And I have to sort of say as well that, I'm a health worker, I'm a midwife. And so often my mind works that if you are trying to figure out a treatment, you need to have an accurate diagnosis first. Because if your diagnosis isn't right, your treatment's not going to be right. And so, yeah, so it's for me, it has taken years to try and get my head around and make sense of, what in the world is happening? Like, how have we gotten here? Why are we in such a mess? And Luke Kemp's diagnosis, in terms of this, what he calls, the Goliaths, the dominance hierarchies, the empire that has taken over the world in this way. He talks about there being sort of precursors or what he calls Goliath fuels. And I found that really interesting too. And that's where the caged land comes in, that you were talking about in terms of land that has been where people are confined to certain land. And he talks about, natural geographical boundaries, like between two rivers where people kind of got stuck. And so when you have the loss of mobility, you've got this caged land, and then you've got weapons. So people actually were able to exert more violence towards each other. And then the lootable resources that Jack just mentioned, which were able to be seen, stolen, and stored. So the grains is often what, Luke is talking about with that. That those are the main precursors to this formation of dominance hierarchies. Those three things: the weapons, the lootable resources, and the caged land. So I think, the fact that the privatization of land, the control of land, like we are so linked to that in our circumstances now. And of course, we can't go back to being nomadic. We've got far too big of a population for that. But how do we share more fairly and have that sense of commons again? And yeah, and I was talking to Jack just before we started about a couple of years where I lived in an Amish community where there was a lot of shared resources and there was a lot of simplicity around the land, the relationship with the land. And I really feel like yeah, the way forward is not necessarily back to a foraging type of lands, of experience, but the way forward as we work with this collapsing, unsustainable way of life has got to be back to certain principles of reciprocity and sharing and the values, I suppose. And I think we'll get there, whether we like it or not. I think it, ultimately, if things collapse without our voluntary control, we'll have to be creative to think about what worked in the past. So anyway, sorry about that. A little bit of a digression.
Yeah, well, we're sort of getting into, I see Paul has his hand raised. Go ahead, Paul. And then we'll move on to the relevance of the framework.
Thanks for the really great comments. I just realizing that the countries that have been most attacked are usually the ones that we've been tried where they've attempted to work more with communities, and Cuba is one of the better examples. And they a really interesting thing with their medical aid to a lot of low-income countries is they always say treat the community rather than the individual. So they work with the communities, but and their whole response has been a more decentralized response. Like community gardens and producing food within the cities. But there is the problem with our modern way of living is that it uses an enormous amount of energy, and when people, even the Cubans look across to the United States, some of them will think, they're missing out on a lot that they could if they had more fossil fuels, but they have a very strong community, and on the happiness indices, you find that they're pretty high on that. And it's interesting with Venezuela, there was a lot of decentralization. The blockade forced people to live on their own resources, and the government actually supported, relative autonomy in the small towns, and the oil industry was something different, and basically Venezuela imported 90% of its food, 20, 30 years ago. And because of the blockade, they ended up growing, only importing 10% of their food. So 90% was produced locally. It was a sort of collapse scenario, but the people became a lot more resilient, and, there was a repair economy. And so, that's looked down on, that sort of economy is looked down at as a failure. And this is a real problem. And even with Iran, I think because they were isolated and had the sanctions, the economy was relatively self-sufficient. So there's a contradiction in what what the media say that we value and what's important. And Yeah, well, I better not say any more. So,
Yeah, actually, Paul, you're reminding me of one of the other things that really struck me about Kemp's work, and that is the idea that post-collapse, people were actually better off.
Mm, mm,
There's evidence that they were healthier, they lived longer, and had more mobility, more leisure, and it's quite different from what and they were no longer under the yoke of the elite domination. You know, Sue, you unmute yourself and go ahead. There
Thanks,
you go.
Jack. What Paul was saying just reminded me of the Maori culture and how that they definitely have the community basis to what they do. And even, during as we all know, during the recent flood events, often it's the Maori culture infrastructure that's been there, and very resilient at helping people affected.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Let's move on to the second item here in our structure, the relevance of the framework. The whole idea of the dominant hierarchy leading to inequality and organized violence and its relevance for our current situation. Anyone like to comment on that? Do you find Kemp's framework useful in understanding where we are now?
Well, if I can chip in, I think it's just almost too obvious to comment. I think we probably all agree there. I think we're reaching a crisis of these very parameters reaching their absolute limit, and terrible things happening. The only difference I see is that in history we've had societal collapses, and we haven't had the same environmental collapses we're now threatened with. Although perhaps there's some comparison in the ice ages, but if we're looking at the main growing regions having to move about 20 degrees further out in latitude in each direction, and there's only land in the northern direction, that's sort of more major than what's happened before, I think.
Yeah, well, there certainly were environmental collapses of specific civilizations previously. But as you point out, we now have a global situation. So one of the things that struck me about the relevance for today is that I hadn't quite appreciated how much the dominant hierarchy pervades our lives
Mm.
and how much we're all subject to it. I don't think we kind of like to admit it, but we accept the narrative of the if it wasn't for civilization, we'd all be at each other's throats, when that's obviously not the way we were in the past, and also not the way people are in disasters. We help each other. It comes out very, very strongly. Any other comments about relevance for today? I mean, Gavin's saying it's so obvious that we don't need to comment, but I'm curious what others think. Pat, are you wanting to mute yourself? And you're still muted. There you go.
Okay. I appreciated how he delineates and links everything together. How one of how he sort of delineates all the different elements that are contributing to global collapse, and he has a lovely symbol which he describes as the rungless ladder. So as we climb up in our so-called development, then the ladder, the step that we've just left on falls away, because, if you like, that's environmental collapse, and he doesn't exactly spell out as I'm just explaining it, but what he's meaning is that we move from sticks and stones and bows and arrows to gunpowder, And they fall away because they become irrelevant until we're left with what? Nuclear stuff. And that is one of the the reasons why we possibly have to look global disaster in the face, one of the various things. But there's a list, there's nukes, there's the possible, well, the likelihood of another pandemic, there's how AI might behave, and then there's the possibility of a solar storm or these natural disasters added on to the ones that we have created ourselves. And then he mentions the Death Star syndrome, which I hadn't really met before. Who says that we've really established a highly complex powerful systems that are vulnerable to catastrophic failure due to overlooked flaws. And this is the hubris of relying on a single solution when there is no single solution. There are many solutions, and the only way out, of course, is to accept that this is a situation, and therefore we need to become resilient. And so then we're back to the other things that he spelt out of ways that we used to live, the ways that predate the Goliath system. So that's really all I have to say. But I had appreciated how it made me look in the face at what really does face us. Enough. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that struck me as well from your comments and others' comments is it's important to remember that the transition from the egalitarian system in the Paleolithic to the dominance hierarchies of the Holocene took thousands of years. It wasn't something that happened quickly, number one. And number two, when we talk about advanced weapons, like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, it wasn't like today where everybody has access to weapons of some sort. It was only the elite that had these weapons. So, and the armies that they controlled. So it was a very unequal situation, in terms of the power and the violence of the power of violence that different groups had. And today's situation, Luke talks about the evolution of Goliaths, of how the lootable resources expanded, from grain because it could be stored and stolen and actually used as currency, for example, all the way up to fossil fuels, which is kind of the ultimate lootable resource, as we can see right now, and what's happening in the Middle East, and the idea that the elites are always expanding, their power is something that it seems so evident now, and makes it that much more difficult for the rest of us to have a say in decisions that affect our lives. Sorry, Robin, you have a hand up there. Didn't see that. Go ahead. Can you unmute yourself and
Thank you, Jack and Sahra. Very, very interesting. Something that struck me is the change in perhaps the way the community behaves to the dark triad, if you like, the narcissists, psychopaths, sociopaths, if that's correct. From the counter-dominant strategies to the way that perhaps many people hold them in high regard. If you think of not only the world leaders, but also company directors and so forth in our civilization. Hopefully that's changing now, but I'm just interested in, this probably comes into the next section of what we can do or how we can reframe, whether it's, say, the dark triad, whether it's the 1% who are using an astronomical percentage of the resources. Yeah, just mulling around in that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, the evolution of Goliath in Kemp's framework is one of increasing power, increasing weapons, increasing inequality, and therefore increasing access to resources. And I think it just occurs to me as well that with our population increase, even though the proportion of people with dominant tendencies and temperaments have always been with us, they're relatively few. But even though they're still few percentage-wise, the fact that there are more of them means that they can collaborate and gain some synergy from the collaboration, even though they also compete with each other, but they also cooperate to keep the system going and the narrative going.
Can I jump in quickly, Jack? Because I
Please,
think
yes, go ahead.
one of the things that I thought you were going to discuss when you were talking about the evolution of Goliaths is how, and I'm sure everyone is aware of this, but how Luke Kemp describes how the most lootable resource now is, yes, fossil fuels, but actually data. And he talks about the current major threat being what he describes as the silicon Goliath, where the whole use of technology to mine personal information. And I think we see that with the way that the Israeli army is using cyber warfare to increase their power and their dominance. And so with the amplification of AI as another dangerous sign, I think that's what you were describing as well, Pat, was the dangerous signs of wealth inequality and nuclear and climate and AI and increasing polarization and authoritarianism and all of these things that we're seeing, and all of it is amplifying, and those are the precursors to a massive global collapse. And that it is based on this extractive consciousness, this extractive behavior of more status, more resources, more power, and power corrupting ultimately is something that Luke really identifies, and the dark triad traits being what give you access to power, and then power, so you can see how this whole thing is an acceleration of extractive impulses. And so I guess, Robin, your question was, what do we make of that? Will it just burn itself out and everything in the process, or is there a way of having a counter dominant strategy to that? Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to discuss, really. And Jack, I guess that's you leading us into the third section now.
Yeah, we're getting into the third section. I mean, Luke Kemp's view is, well, he does present some data where the evidence of societies reversing Goliath, but he points out that there's not many, number one, and number two, even those examples show that the reversal is temporary. The Goliaths bounce back. Um, so it raises, the question. I mean, in the book, he got into it a little bit in the interview, but in the book, he lists a whole bunch of things, ways of, trying to deal with the current situation. And one of the major ones, and this is from exchanges I've had with him outside of the interview, is he feels very strongly about citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy methodologies, and the Taiwan model of online consensus building. As he seems to think that these are very powerful and encouraging and constructive ways of trying to minimize the influence of vested interest, because they involve, consent. It's much more of a participatory, decision making. Again, akin to what we had in the Paleolithic period. But those are still they're growing, and it's encouraging that they're growing in terms of frequency. People probably know that there have been several examples, in New Zealand as well as around the world. But it's still far from mainstream, and politicians are, generally a bit suspicious of giving up their authority and their decision-making roles. But it's certainly something to support, citizens' assemblies and the online consensus processes as ways of countering the dominance hierarchy. But what are people's thoughts about what do we do about this?
And I can chip in here because I've been thinking about for years about how can I help the issue of inequality, and how can I lend my tiny weight to pushing forward participatory deliberative democracy. And I've got a couple of suggestions in this area, which have to do with teaming up with others who are trying to work in the same direction. There's an organization called Trust Democracy, which exists for the purpose of promoting deliberative democracy. And I've recently joined that organization. And just today, I got an email from Anne Bardsley, who is possibly New Zealand's most experienced practitioner of citizens' assemblies and also online variants of deliberative democracy, to say that she and her group at University of Auckland, Complex Conversations, are about to start what they call a community of practice in deliberative democracy, and in inviting people to join for their introductory meeting, which is on the 15th of April. So if any of you, I think Trust Democracy is possibly the organization that has a broad remit to promote these processes, and might be the one to think of first in terms of joining. But if you're thinking of actually trying to get involved in doing it, then let me know, and I will send you the invitation to join the community of practice. And in thinking myself, how can I contribute my little mite to pushing us towards a more equal society, I joined the Tax Justice Association based in Wellington, and they will spring into action towards the election for what do they call it? Better taxes, better society, or something like that. They'll be encouraging us to talk more about creating a more equal society, and perhaps the most powerful and beginning lever to do that is our taxation system. It's certainly not the only one, but it does seem like a good one. So I would also encourage people to join the Tax Justice Society, Tax Justice Association. I think TJA. That's it. Thanks.
Good,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Joe. Any other
Oh,
comments?
can I just say one
Yeah,
more
yeah,
thing?
go ahead. Go ahead.
I just want to give a little thumbs up or salute to Gavin for bringing Peter Kropotkin into the discussion. I'm slightly in love with Peter Kropotkin. Don't tell Jack. But he was a most wonderful person and a wonderful thinker and a great writer. So yeah, have a look for his stuff.
Yeah, definitely
He is
worth reading.
yeah, he's relevant to our discussion.
Yeah. Gavin, is that your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. You've brought the subject around to economics a bit. Tax justice made my ears flap. I belong to Basic Income New Zealand, and I can see the desire for that, the thrust for that, fitting into Luke Kemp's framework in a way, because there are so many huge weapons today, including, as you say, the silicon one. But I do think money's the biggest, and the economics invented by by civilization, and because money is the measurement of what other people don't have. That's the way I see it. And we've been talking about inequality so many times tonight, but inequality is the thing which seems to be growing and growing in power faster than anything else. And I can see basic income. I think basic income is a fantastic shortcut to a lot of the things that a lot of people want, but you need a government that's willing to assert its financial sovereignty, money sovereignty, and start paying it out. Because I can see the freedom this would give a lot of people to stop working in bad jobs, toxic jobs, warmongering jobs, and well, in fact, what do we call them? Dominance jobs. And this is a small enough country, perhaps, to make it happen better than any other country if it could only get into public prominence.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a number of folks who haven't made any comments. If any of you would like to, we'd welcome to hear from as many as possible. So do feel free to indicate you'd like to say something. So far, we've been talking about the examples have largely been about changing the system and working within the system. Oh, Robin's got a hand up again. Go ahead, Robin.
Okay. This is following up on something that you said, Sahra. Wondering if you could elaborate about the need that I think you said psychological preparation or education around either the need for an alternative or a paradigm shift, systems changes, and perhaps how or who could do this.
Well, you've just tapped into the heart of my passion, so I'll try to stay brief because I could give a whole 2-hour talk on this right now. This is the core of my focus at the moment. And I think what it comes down to is that what I feel most accurately is that modernity, as we experience it now, is a carnival of misplaced longings. I think we are so confused as a species about what we really long for. And so the pursuit of status and wealth and, the dominance strategies are because we're really longing for something which is immaterial and is about relationship and connection and belonging and that those are qualities that are in our collective consciousness, in the way that we are together. And so I am, just to make it a bit more practical, I am working now in groups of people, looking at how do we support each other into a place of psychological adaptation, because the overwhelm of witnessing and feeling everything that is happening geopolitically and even within our own country is so hard to bear on our own. And so having groups of people where we discuss these things, where we share the grief, where we talk about how we can strengthen relationships, particularly when there's conflict or differences of opinion. And at the moment, I'm exploring psychodrama for that, and sociodrama, which are possibly things that modalities that people are familiar here. But also, linking that to the practicalities of, how do we start to think about what skills we have so that we can help each other? Who's got, the best bike repair skills on our road? Who's got, ways of making bread from non-wheat, material? How do we, forage together? It's like there's ways of doing these practical things that actually strengthen the relationships, because I really feel that it's our relationship that gives us meaning to each other, and ultimately the relationship with our own ecosystem. We live in a world of human supremacy, and so what happens when we shift the way that we think about our relationship with our, animal kin, our animal family, and our, plant relatives? And so I think really looking at how we place ourselves into our worlds in an animate way, in a way that makes sense to our collaborative nature. Going back to, I think, why Luke Kemp was so meaningful to me, is that he really shifted the way I see propaganda now. It's like this whole idea that Hobbes introduced, that humans are brutish and short and violent, and that's propaganda. It's like going back to what we're longing for is actually connection. And so can we do, the meaningful things together? And yeah, so that's the short answer, I would say. There's lots more components to that, but that's just a brief riff on psychological adaptation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Sahra, you're mentioning status, and Kemp points out that status seeking is a natural activity. The question becomes how we do it. Is it based on, as you suggest, particular skills? There's evidence that in the hunter-gathering societies, the great hunter doesn't necessarily get to make decisions outside of hunting. It's specific to a particular area. So it's particular skills or characteristics that can provide status. The problem arises when status is sought by power, dominance, and inequality. So I think it's helpful to distinguish between the status and and power. The other thing that reminds me of is that having status, having a role in society, in your community, is a universal basic need. It means we're connected. It means we are valued. It means we are contributing. It means we can expect reciprocity. All of those things. And again, basic needs. One of the challenges I see in terms of dealing with our modern global Goliath is that it's so pervasive. I mean, it controls our basic needs, our food source, our energy source, housing regulations about what we can and can't build and how we're to live. All of those basic things are controlled, and the importance of reclaiming control and our own authority, I think, over those basic needs, to me seems like a way of both preparing for collapse, which is I mean, I have no idea whether it's going to happen tomorrow or next month or next year or next century, but every civilization has collapsed and ours is likely to as well. And it seems to me that preparing for collapse by focusing on basic needs with your community is one of the best strategies for changing the system, because the system isn't going to respond to our prodding and pleading. But if we develop an alternative, then we're providing living examples of what's possible, based on what we've known from our deep past and Paleolithic times and indigenous peoples. It's not an easy route, but it's one that seems to me to be a worthwhile thing to be doing, is building resilience around basic needs at a community, ideally at a neighborhood level. Because ultimately, if when and if collapse comes, it's going to be the people you can walk to or cycle to that are going to become the most important people in your life. And so developing those relationships and working together for mutual aid and mutual support seems to me like both a fun thing and a very important way of increasing our likelihood of surviving.
Thank you, Pat, and have a good night. Yeah.
Take care. Yeah. Whoops. Sorry, are people still there?
Yep, all good.
Okay, no,
Paul's got his hand up.
I pushed a wrong button here somewhere.
It's all right. Paul, do you want to?
Oh, there we are.
Just while Jack
Paul, go ahead, Paul. You have to unmute yourself, Paul.
I just want to say one of the great strengths in New Zealand and possibly other places is the community groups or the take care groups, and they probably vary from place to place, but I know here in Brooklyn was a bowling club, and that's reconfigured as a resource centre, and it has repair workshops and dinners. And there's enormous amount of participation with music and a toy library, and it's just, it fills a real function, and there's a real strength in that group. But I imagine that there's a lot of other groups, and we know the Marais have been really instrumental in assisting communities when there's been flooding, and it's sort of copying model that will help us to survive. But I think the government is totally underestimating the collapse in availability of fossil fuels because we're so dependent on them for food and freight, that we're going to be, reliant on local communities and on community gardens, and basically using electric services. And Wellington has electric trains, but they don't actually go all the way to Wairaka. There's still diesel required to go from up to Masterton, but the Kapiti Coast is relatively well connected. But I don't quite imagine.
You're breaking up a little bit, Paul. But thank you. Yeah, I certainly agree with you. And I think,
Always have a bad connection.
yeah. Are you finished?
We can't hear you, Paul, so we'll assume it's a technical issue.
Yeah. I think one of the things I just wanted to say,
Oh. No, Paul, I think we're going to have to move on to someone else just simply because the tech's breaking down for you.
yeah. So
Go
just
ahead,
a
Sarah.
response there. Right at the beginning of our call, I was talking about how it feels at the moment for some of us, I suppose, with the increasing awareness and concern that this fuel crisis has brought to the mainstream awareness. And ironically, after sort of 4 years of feeling like I've been, desperately trying to blow the whistle of, waking people up to the urgency of, things are unraveling, and now that it's in the foreground, I feel like I actually feel more relaxed. It's like people are starting to understand what I've been talking about. And so when I explain about my concerns around, geopolitical unraveling, and like people can actually connect and make sense of something that previously felt like they thought I was some sort of conspiracy theorist or something. And so what the point that I want to make is that it feels like there's such an opportunity. It was like with COVID, people did go to, into their communities, and they formed relationships, and streets started interacting. And this is another opportunity where every time there's a shock like this, we can practice what it's going to be like as things become less convenient and less secure and less stable. And actually, that in general, it feels like the population has an opportunity to think about what a simplification and mutual aid type reality might require of us. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also reiterate a point that Paul made, and that is that there are lots of existing groups doing bits and pieces. You don't have to start from scratch. Join a group and try to help them understand some of these issues, and work with them and work together to build local community resilience. That's I think is going to make a huge difference, as well as trying to and to me, the deliberative democracy examples that we talked about fit right into that, because working with local groups means you have to make your decisions together, and it's not always easy, but it's certainly doable, and it's worth the Sturm und Drang to go through the difficulties, because we've got to learn to do it again. We're quite capable of doing it. We just have to get out of our comfort zones enough to do it. And I guess that brings me to what wasn't on the list there about the structure, but Sahra and I wanted to suggest and offer to anyone interested an opportunity to have ongoing discussions about this issue of what do we do? How do we respond both personally at an emotional level? And, how much do we try to change the existing system, and how much do we, attempt to balance that with trying to create alternative systems, that meet people's local needs. So if anyone's interested in that, I think if you go to our climate declaration website and leave a message, we'll get back to you and try to set up perhaps a monthly chat group or something like that. We can self-organize it and see what comes out of it.
And my final comment to everyone, other than just, warm support and solidarity and, really feeling with each of you, many of you who have been dealing with these issues for far longer than most. If you haven't already, I would strongly recommend the book Civilized to Death by Christopher Ryan. It's a great companion book to Luke Kemp's work. And Christopher Ryan is a charming author. He writes incredibly well. He's very, very successful as an author, but he's written this fantastic book called Civilized to Death, and it's along similar lines to Luke Kemp's work. And it would be another great book to share and discuss and draw encouragement from. I actually found it very heartening. So if you want a good read, I'd recommend that one.
Yep. Yeah, I would reinforce Sarah's recommendation. She sent me a copy, and I haven't quite finished it, but I'm really enjoying it. It is a nice supplement and a little bit different perspective from Luke's, but certainly on the same themes and also helpful. Okay, any last comments from anyone? Suggestions? And anyone want to comment about this format? We haven't done this before, where we just have a discussion about something that.
I see your hand, Beverly. Did you have
Yeah, I
something?
see Bev has her hand up, but go ahead, Bev. And then I think Jane wanted to say something as well. But go ahead, Bev. You're muted, Bev. You can't unmute? Okay, well, I think, Jane, did you want to say something?
Oh, just quickly, I popped on real late, so I'm going to look at the video. I was just going to watch the video, actually, and then I realized you'd be chatting. So I just think it's great to have a mutual support group. Thank you for the offer. Yeah, I think it's
Right.
going to be
Yeah, well,
really,
there's
really helpful to have, be able to brainstorm ideas and just grassroots things. Very good. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Luke Kemp has been very generous with his time, and he's done dozens of webinars, so you can find them all over the net, and each one's a bit different. Different interviewers bring out different aspects of it because it's a massive and very scholarly work that he's done. Any and all of them are good to watch. Robin, did you have your hand up again? Did you want to say something? No? Okay. Any other last comments or suggestions or feedback about this
I
format?
think I've overcome the problem of me being mute. I just wanted to make a wee comment about our website. People talk about books that have really inspired them. Could we have a book and podcast recommendation section on our website where people can put ideas of books that have inspired them, and then we can gradually all get to read those books. Like I'm right in the middle of Dark Money and Democracy in Chains at the moment, and I need some light relief. That book sounds lovely. Thank you.
You'll enjoy this book. It's written like a novel.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. Maybe we could put some comedy on there too.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, well, if there are no other comments, I'll thank you on behalf of our climate declaration and the team, and hope that this has been a useful exercise for us all. And obviously, it's an ongoing thing, so it's not a simple issue to tick off. So if anyone would like to join the a discussion group, let us know through the Art Declaration website, and we'll get back and set something up. Okay, well, thanks all.
Thank you. It's
Be
great.
well,
Thank you, Jack.
enjoy, and
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Sahra.
Good night.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
yeah, and
Lovely
I
to
wish
see you.
this was all just an April Fool's joke, but I'm afraid it's real.
Yeah.
Take care.
You got
Bye-bye.
Mike Joy,
Bye-bye.
Joy next week, right?
Yes, next week.
Yeah, right. The 8th of just next week, Mike Joy will be presenting, and Mike's always interesting. So do join us if you can. Night, night.
All right.